I'm a single guy in my mid-40s, and I've been living by myself in this rented townhouse for almost 2 years now. It's a pleasant place in a calm part of town. Nothing extravagant, but it's cozy, and the rent is fair. I've settled into a nice routine here and really feel as if I've made it my own home. The odd event took place on a Saturday night around midnight. I was getting ready to call it a night when I heard hard pounding on my front door. It wasn't a polite knock, but loud banging, as if someone was trying to force their way in. I glanced out the window, but I couldn't see much because of how the porch light was positioned and the sky was overcast. Despite not being able to see who was there and the aggressiveness of the banging, I'm a fairly strong guy, so I wasn't scared. I was mostly annoyed and confused. I opened the main door, careful to keep the storm door latched as an extra layer of protection. I didn't know what I expected to see, but what I did witness was surprising, to say the least. There was an agitated man standing there. He seemed to be maybe a decade younger than me. He was quite taller than average, had a scruffy beard and unkempt hair, and was wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in a long time. What struck me was how really angry and unstable he appeared. His eyes were darting around, and he was breathing heavily, like he had been sprinting or was on the verge of a panic attack. He was also pacing erratically, unable to stand still. Before I could even ask him what he wanted, he started shouting that this was his home and demanded that I let him in immediately. He claimed that I was the intruder and that he was going to call the authorities if I didn't get out right away. I thought he was either under the influence or having a mental health crisis, or perhaps some combination. I tried to calm him down and told him he must have the wrong address, but that seemed to make him even more agitated. That's when he began rattling off specific details about the house that made me freeze. I can't even remember every single thing he said, but he knew several things about the interior that you couldn't tell from the street. Things someone who had lived here would know. For example, he pointed out that the door to the primary bedroom is badly positioned and bangs against the dresser. He mentioned that the patio door sticks and you have to lift it slightly while turning the handle. There were other details too, but I really can't recall them all. I don't think I even spoke while he was talking. I just stood there in disbelief. But that was only the start. Things were about to get much, much stranger. Through the glass door, he pulled out a folder and started showing me paperwork. He had what looked like a rental agreement with his name on it, dated from about a year before I moved in. He had envelopes addressed to him at this address. Everything looked legitimate, though I assumed it had been forged somehow. The most unsettling part was when he pulled out his phone and began showing me photos. They were actual pictures of him inside my house, sitting on my current couch watching shows, cooking in the kitchen, even lying down in what is now my bedroom. The photos looked recent and completely genuine. They weren't obviously manipulated or staged, and many of them included other people, none of whom I had ever seen. He showed me one picture that he claimed was from New Year's Eve of last year, just a few months before. It was a selfie taken by a man I didn't recognize. In it, the man, him, and a few other people were facing the camera and smiling at the dining table. There was a bottle of champagne and party hats off to the side, and the detail and context of the picture made it seem entirely authentic. That's when I started seriously questioning my own memory and grip on reality. How could this stranger have all that evidence if he never lived here? I began wondering if I had somehow suppressed memories of sharing the house with someone, and if I was the one experiencing some kind of breakdown. It was unsettling, especially because I knew for a fact that I had been home on New Year's Eve, so the photos made even less sense. The whole situation was so surreal that I told him I was going to phone the police to sort everything out. I wasn't even being confrontational. I simply didn't know what else to do. I figured they could check the records and determine what was really happening. But the moment I mentioned calling law enforcement, the guy's demeanor changed completely. He suddenly became calm and said he'd wait outside while I made the call. Then he just walked away from the door and disappeared into the darkness. I watched from the window, but I couldn't see where he went. When the police arrived about 10 minutes later, I explained the whole bizarre encounter. They told me I should try reaching out to my landlord to contact any previous tenants, and that maybe I'd get some answers that way. I had all the necessary documentation proving I was leasing this place, but when I offered to show it to them, they waved me off. They said whoever had been at my doorstep was probably going through some kind of episode, and as long as he was gone, I should just continue with my life. Then they left. I wasn't going to just accept that, though. Whether or not that guy had left still left the question of how on earth he had all that evidence. With my landlord's help, I was eventually able to get in touch with the prior tenants. I should mention that my landlord had no idea what had happened and said he didn't know anyone matching the man's description and had never rented to anyone like that. But anyway, the former tenants also had no idea who I was talking about. They said they had never lived with anyone matching his description, and they had been in the house alone for several years before moving out. They were as completely baffled as I was about how this stranger could have such detailed knowledge of the house and legitimate pictures of himself inside it. For the next month or so, I was constantly on edge, but nothing happened, and I started to think that maybe it had just been some elaborate scam that had failed. But of course, that turned out to be mostly wishful thinking. One evening, I came home from an evening out with friends to find my home completely ransacked. It wasn't like a typical break-in where someone grabs obvious valuables and bolts. The place was completely overturned, as if someone had been searching for something specific. What that thing was, I had no idea. The weirdest part is that most of my electronics and other expensive items were still there, even though the rooms they were in were thoroughly trashed. The police found no signs of forced entry, which suggested that whoever did it had a copy of my key. Given the timing and connection to the bizarre incident a few weeks earlier, it seemed obvious that the same person was responsible. The police took things more seriously after that, and so did my landlord. He replaced all the locks in the house immediately at no cost to me, and also installed additional security measures, including an alarm system and motion lights. The prevailing theory, and the one I tend to believe, is that some disturbed person truly believes he lives in my house and broke in to search for his personal belongings or something. And okay, that's disturbing enough on its own, but that doesn't explain how he had all that paperwork, let alone what looked like exact copies of my house key. I wish I had thought to take a closer look at that so-called lease agreement he showed me, because I might have been able to get his name. But in the moment, I just wasn't thinking clearly. The documents don't even bother me that much. All that stuff could have been easily forged or altered, including the supposed pieces of mail. What really unsettles me to my core, though, are the pictures. I have no explanation for any of that material. It's possible they're really old pictures whose dates are doctored. But even if that's the case, it still doesn't explain how my landlord, who has owned that house his entire life, didn't recognize him. One of my friends suggested that I'm dealing with something supernatural, or not quite natural. I don't normally believe in that, but I will say that I've had this constant creepy feeling hanging over me whenever I'm in my own home, which is most of the time. I can't even begin to rationalize the whole situation. I just hope that's the end of it. This all happened about 5 years ago. I grew up in a cozy, slightly cramped townhouse. For most of my childhood, I shared a room with my older sister. 2 single beds were placed on opposite walls, 2 small dressers, and 2 wardrobes filled the room. There wasn't even space for a proper chair. It wasn't overly tight, but it wasn't exactly comfortable either. So when my sister went off to university, I immediately rearranged the space and claimed her bed area, with her approval, of course. At that age, having a study desk in my bedroom was essential. It was a relief to finally do homework in my own space rather than in the living room or my dad's study upstairs. That setup lasted perfectly for the 2 years before I went off to college myself, at which point living at home was no longer relevant. After graduating, my sister took a job in the city not far from our hometown, so we both returned to our parents' house. Predictably, the first thing she did was reorganize the bedroom I had spent months personalizing. I felt a bit annoyed at first, but my parents pointed out that I had done the same to her years before, so it was fair. I couldn't argue and accepted it. By the time I graduated, I had secured a local job, so I also moved back into my parents' home. Unfortunately, my old room was no longer available, so I had to find another place. The only vacant room upstairs was the smaller guest bedroom, which would have to suffice. It was next to my dad's office, the only other room on that floor. The room was also right above the garage, meaning each time the garage door opened, the floor vibrated noticeably for about 10 seconds. The room extended slightly beyond the house corner, giving it two windows on perpendicular walls, one overlooking the front yard and one facing the side of the house. Not perfect, but mostly quiet and private. This particular incident occurred on a Saturday night when I was home alone. My sister was attending a conference in another state, and my parents were at our cabin in the mountains for the weekend. I had just finished an exhausting day at work and decided to stay in, order some dinner, and call it an early night. Around 11:15 p.m., I was in bed reading, trying to relax. The house was completely silent, which was unusual since it was normally loud when everyone was home. Then I heard the garage door start to move, followed by the familiar vibration across the floor. It took me a few seconds to process it. None of my family should have been home. My parents had said they'd be away until Sunday evening, and my sister wasn't coming back until the next day. Once it sank in, my heart started pounding. I got out of bed and looked out the window toward the driveway, but the darkness made it impossible to see clearly. I could see the garage door was open, but couldn't tell if a car was inside or who had opened it. Without thinking, I grabbed one of the baseball bats stored in the closet since my childhood. As I quietly descended the stairs, I tried to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe my parents returned briefly, or my sister had changed plans, or maybe the door had a malfunction. Approaching the bottom of the stairs, just before turning toward the main hallway, I heard muffled voices. They were coming from the bedroom corridor, too quiet to understand the words, but clearly at least two people. That's when I knew someone had broken in. I dialed 911 quietly, whispering my address and explaining that my home was being broken into. I left the line open and slipped the phone into my pocket. The operator advised me to stay put, but I felt a strong urge to confront the intruders. Against her instructions, I moved forward. I crept down the hall toward the voices, gripping the bat tightly. Near my parents' bedroom, I could hear drawers opening and things being shifted. They were clearly searching for valuables. I took a deep breath, knowing what I was about to do was risky, but I couldn't stop. I yelled to startle them, then stormed into the room with the bat raised. Two men were rifling through my mother's dresser and shouted in shock when I appeared. They clearly hadn't expected anyone home, especially not someone ready to fight. Despite being outnumbered, I felt a rush of confidence. I swung at the closer man, hitting his leg. He cursed and stumbled before falling. I turned to the other, but he lunged and tackled me before I could react. We hit the ground hard, and I quickly realized he was much larger and stronger than me. He took the bat easily and grabbed my neck, choking me. I struggled, scratching at his hands when the first man approached me, holding what looked like a small knife. In that moment, I realized that trying to be a hero was a grave mistake. A mistake that could cost me my life. As we fell to the floor, my eyes searched for something, anything that could give me a chance. That's when I saw a small pocket knife under the bed, partially hidden, probably left behind by someone who had used the room before. My heart raced. Without thinking, I reached out, grabbed the knife, and in a desperate impulse, I stabbed the man who was choking me. He screamed and stepped back for a moment, and I continued to defend myself with all the strength I could muster. Each strike was a mix of terror and determination. I couldn't die there, not like that. The second man, still perplexed, hesitated, and I managed to partially free myself. I fought like never before, stabbing again with the pocket knife until, finally, both intruders fell, either motionless or fleeing in disarray. I could hardly believe what I had done. My hands were shaking, and adrenaline was coursing through my veins. The room was silent except for my own heavy breathing. When I finally recovered enough to stand, I heard the distant sound of police sirens approaching. I felt relieved knowing help was on the way, but a heavy feeling overcame me. The reality of what I had done was beginning to sink in. I had hurt, or perhaps killed, someone. My mind struggled to process the shock, the guilt, and the fear all at once. Shortly after, the police arrived, quickly entering the house. I explained the situation, breathing heavily, and they immediately began checking the bodies. They confirmed that I had acted in self-defense, but nothing could erase the psychological impact of the act. I was safe, my parents were out of danger, but something inside me had changed irrevocably. My parents and sister arrived shortly after. shocked at the scene and trying to comfort me. They lightly scolded me for confronting the intruders alone, but their concern was now focused on my emotional stability. The feeling of having taken someone's life was overwhelming. In the following days, I remained disturbed and anxious, reliving every detail, every strike. My father immediately installed additional security systems in the house, cameras, motion sensors, and reinforced doors, but none of that could erase the memory of death in my hands. All doors were locked, and the garage could only be opened with the wireless button installed in the car, but I no longer lived there. The intruders were taken to hell, but the effects of that event haunt me to this day. My father remained extremely cautious for years, fearing that someone close to the family might have been involved. And I, despite surviving physically, continued to deal with the psychological weight of confronting death so directly. I won't say that night changed me physically, but life before and after feeling your own mortality and facing the consequences of taking a life is completely different. I still remember the surreal sensation of thinking it would be the end, followed by the indescribable mix of relief and guilt. Nothing compares to that, and the memory stays with me, vivid and disturbing. This happened about 8 months ago, and even now, I still feel the weight of it every time I think about how calculated and personal the whole situation was. I had recently moved back to my hometown to help care for my elderly mother, who lives roughly 25 minutes away from me. I found a modest townhouse that seemed perfect for my situation. Small enough to manage easily on my own, but just far enough that I could maintain some independence. It was close to my mother, so I could reach her quickly if needed, yet distant enough that I wouldn't be underfoot or constantly interrupted. My mother had been struggling with minor health issues recently. Nothing life-threatening, but she had suffered a few minor falls around the house. She's incredibly stubborn and refuses most help, insisting that she's perfectly fine, even when she clearly isn't. I had been urging her to get a medical alert system, something that could at least give me peace of mind, but she adamantly refused. "I don't need one," she told me. "You're just being overprotective." This small but constant tension between us had been wearing me down. I couldn't stop thinking about her being alone for hours at a time, vulnerable to any accident or misfortune. That particular evening, I was finally settling in for a quiet night. It was around 8:45 p.m., and I had curled up on the couch with a blanket, my mind half on the TV and half still fretting about my mother. Then, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize, which immediately made me cautious, but I answered anyway. Being new to the area, I thought it might be something important. That particular evening, I was finally settling in for a quiet night. It was around 8:45 p.m., and I had curled up on the couch with a blanket, my mind half on the TV and half still fretting about my mother. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize, which immediately made me cautious, but I answered anyway. Being new to the area, I thought it might be something important. The voice on the other end introduced herself as a nurse from a nearby hospital. Her tone was calm, professional, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. She told me that my mother had been admitted about an hour ago after a fall, and that she had hit her head. According to her, my mother was awake, asking for me specifically, and they needed to know if I could get to the hospital as quickly as possible. My stomach dropped. Every parent's child knows that gut-clenching panic, the kind where your body refuses to obey your brain. I was horrified. This was the exact call I had been dreading since moving back. I didn't doubt the legitimacy of her story for even a second. The nurse rattled off my mother's full name, her address, and even mentioned her hip replacement surgery from a few months prior. My mind was spinning. How could someone know so much? I tried to calm myself with a silent prayer, repeating her name under my breath. I didn't even think about locking the door or taking precautions for my own safety. I grabbed my keys, shut the front door behind me, and jumped into my car. My hands shook slightly as I started the engine. The drive to the hospital was torturous. Every red light, every passing car felt like a countdown to the worst possible news. I ran through a dozen scenarios in my mind, none of them good. When I arrived at the ER, I rushed straight to the reception desk. The drive to the hospital was torturous. Every red light, every passing car felt like a countdown to the worst possible news. I ran through a dozen scenarios in my mind, none of them good. When I arrived at the ER, I rushed straight to the reception desk. My heart was hammering so hard I felt it in my throat. I explained I was there for my mother, giving her name and mentioning the call I had received. The receptionist's face shifted from polite curiosity to confusion. She checked her computer and said there was no record of my mother being admitted or treated that evening. I insisted there must be a mistake. I described the call, word for word. The receptionist, sympathetic yet firm, repeated that there was no record of my mother and suggested I call her directly. Stepping outside, I dialed her landline. She answered groggily, asking why I was calling so late. Relief and confusion collided in my chest. I tried not to alarm her and said I was just checking in, telling her to go back to sleep. That's when the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was a setup. Someone had deliberately fed me false information to lure me out of my house. I sped back home, fury mixing with anxiety. When I arrived, the front door was exactly as I had left it. For a brief, almost cruel moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all. But the second I stepped inside, dread surged through me. I knew the house had been broken into. The place was completely ransacked. My television, laptop, and a small jewelry collection were gone. But what unsettled me even more were the personal items that had been taken. Family photos had been removed from their frames, leaving empty glass panes behind. Not just random photos, images of birthdays, graduations, and family vacations. Even my prescription bottles from the bathroom medicine cabinet were emptied and taken. These items had little monetary value but enormous sentimental significance. It was almost sadistic, the way the thieves seemed to be deliberately tormenting me. I called the police immediately. My voice was shaky, almost trembling. Deep down, I knew the culprits were long gone. I gave the officers a detailed account, recalling every word of the phone call. They quickly concluded, as I had suspected, that whoever had contacted me knew details about my mother and me that no stranger could possibly have. For hours, I tried to list anyone who might have had such information. I couldn't think of anyone who would know these personal details or how they could have obtained them. The officers advised me to call back with any new leads and left. The sense of violation was overwhelming. Imagine realizing a stranger knew enough about you and your family to manipulate you into leaving your home. The theft itself was upsetting, but the fact that family photos and medical information were targeted suggested a deeper, more sinister motive, perhaps identity theft or some other long-term scheme. Over the next few weeks, nothing further occurred. I suspected that, among my mother's large circle of friends, someone might have inadvertently leaked information. She can't remember anyone specific, but it seemed likely. I warned her to be cautious, and she has since become more mindful about sharing personal details. Still, I can't shake the sense that we might still be under observation. Someone knows far too much about our lives, and I can't tell if they've finished their plan. To counter this, I installed a Ring camera outside the house, hoping it will act as a deterrent. Every time it chimes, I jump a little, the tension never fully leaving me. Even now, thinking back, I feel a strange mix of anger, fear, and unease. It's one thing to be robbed for money, but another entirely to be manipulated so personally. I wonder who it was, whether they're still out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity. Every sound at night makes me double-check the locks. Every unfamiliar knock makes my heart race. If anything else happens, I will document it immediately. But one thing is certain. After experiencing something this deliberate and personal, life feels different. Every sense of security is fragile, and the memory of that night will likely haunt me indefinitely.